I welcome everybody to today's EBRAINS Capacity Development training session on Introduction to Responsible Data Governance. Today's session is going to be anchored by three presenters, myself, Damian Eke, as the HBP Data Governance Coordinator, Simisola Akintoye, who is the HBP Data Protection Officer, and William Knight, who is the HBP Compliance Manager. So the HBP, or in full, the EU Human Brain Project is a flagship project, Future and Emerging Technology project that started in 2013, and we're now at the final phase of the project. It is a project that it's aimed to create a cutting-edge research infrastructure for the advancement of knowledge in the fields of neuroscience, computing, and brain-related medicine. And that research infrastructure is EBRAINS. EBRAINS, it's a distributed research infrastructure for brain research, launched in 2019, and it's emerging from the research that has gone on since 2013. And it provides tools and services to allow scientists and researchers to collect data, to store the data, to analyze it and share it. I also apply the brain data in the different research questions. And these services, the most important thing about these services is that they are all interoperable, from data storage to data simulation. So, as the figure in this slide indicates, EBRAINS offers the science community a state-of-the-art infrastructure with different services and platforms for brain data, for simulation and modeling tools, and also offers exceptionally access to supercomputing resources. So what are the services that EBRAINS offers? The first service is a data and knowledge service, which is an online solution to facilitate sharing of and access to research data, and not only research data, but also computational models and software. And the atlases, which is closely related to the data and knowledge service, where users can navigate and characterize or analyze information on the basis of an anatomical location of the brain. And also we have diverse simulation services, which are solutions for brain researchers to conduct sustainable simulation studies and share their results. And also this is something that is exceptional in terms of brain research infrastructures. We also offer brain-inspired technologies to help researchers to understand and leverage computational capabilities of the spiking neural networks. And then we also have medical data analytics, which is a service that provides two unique platforms covering key areas in clinical neuroscience research. As I said earlier, I think all the services that EBRAINS offers are interoperable, and they are co-designed by researchers that have been working in the HBP for the last 9 years. So in all the services that we offer, we have major data-related platform or services. One is the data and knowledge service, that can help you to share your data, share your models, and also share your software. But also, it also provides a knowledge graph that can help you to find data, models, and also software. And is open to international research community. Currently, we are accepting requests to provide curation services from different parts of the world. And it has a long-term storage plan. If you're a researcher and you're trying to share your data or store your data in an archive, I think our data and knowledge platform is a service for you. And then we also have the virtual brain that helps researchers to create personalized brain models and stimulate multi-scale networks. It's a service that offers a virtual working environment for researchers that you can come in with your data sets, perform your simulation services, and then also you can leave with your results. That's a unique service that we provide through the TVB. And then finally, but not the least, we have the medical informatics platform, which is the MIP, that offers MIP offers federated infrastructure services, where we have data sets from hospitals or other research institutions where the raw data is kept, but then the data is federated in a way that aggregates of the data are collected in the MIP federated and made public, while the data sets, the original data set, remains in the hospitals. But it's also a unique platform that offers clinical data sets for brain research, which it's not usually found in open repositories out there. So, as the theme of today is data governance, we have these three data-driven platforms. How do we govern the data? How do we ensure that data processing pipelines are responsibly processed? What we do is to establish data governance mechanisms that allows the integration of responsibility, transparency, and trustworthiness. So for us, data governance is about the principles, the procedures, the frameworks, or policies that ensure acceptable, responsible processing of data at each stage of the data lifecycle, from collection, storage, processing, curation, sharing, and use, and also to deletion. So it is not a one-stage process. A one-stage process in the data processing pipeline. It's a robust process that comprehensively addresses data governance challenges from collection to deletion. So it is a process to maintain data integrity, the quality of the data, to make data available, accessible, usable, and secure. And it's a process also that defines clear roles and responsibilities for the different stakeholders within the data processing workflow. So for us, it is not just about data protection or addressing the legal issues. We'll also address other issues in a responsible way. And that's why we call it responsible data governance, because we not only address the legal issues, we also address the ethical issues, we also address the technical issues. And some of the ethical issues that we deal with include informed consent, autonomy, bias and discrimination in the data, misuse of the data, dual use issues, and also animal welfare issues, which are ethical issues that might not be evident in the law and regulatory provisions. Also, we all address legal issues, which are obvious in some of the legal provisions that are available, data privacy, and in that we address the lawful basis of processing the data, who is the data controller, and also access control mechanisms and the transfer of data from one region to the other. So these are legal issues that we encounter and interact with, and also we address technical issues, talking about the different metadata standards, talking about the different technologies that can ensure responsible data governance or ensure compliance to the law, like encryption or like pseudonymization or anonymization. These are technical issues that we also encounter and address. So in the different stages of the data lifecycle, there are key issues that we have identified that we continually interact with and address. At the collection stage of the data lifecycle, issues of consent, informed consent are always there. The sampling bias, it can be regulatory differences and legal basis for collection. Regulatory differences here, an example will be animal data welfare differences. Because in different regions, there are different provisions and ethical values that drive the the suitability of animal experimentation, and that is always a problem when we address data sharing in eBrains. In processing, is the data anonymized? Is it pseudonymized or de-identified? These are issues that we continually address, especially with the changing landscape of technology, where previously accepted anonymization techniques are no longer suitable to ensure security and privacy and confidentiality of the data subjects. So these are issues that we continually address. Curation, we deal with standardization. That's the metadata standardization, and that's why we have developed a standardization mechanism or approach called Open Minds, which maybe you can encounter in some other trainings. And then diversity of data sets, how diverse and heterogeneous are the data sets available for researchers within in eBrains. And then archiving, we deal with issues of security, cybersecurity of the for the data sets, the issue of controllership, who owns the data, which is a very contentious subject that we're not focusing on at this point. And then there are also issues on the application stage, in the application stage, or use issues of incidental findings. How do we address issues of incidental findings, bias and discrimination, misuse, dual use, commercialization or exploitation of the data sets, and sharing, which is a critical aspect of data processing. Who has access to the data? Who do we give access to the data set? What are the risks involved in re-identification, and also licensing and attribution, and also deletion. This is something that people don't usually think about, but there are critical issues that we've identified also in deletion, loss of data, and unintended deletion or inappropriate retention of data. These are issues our data governance mechanism addresses in eBrains. So what is our eBrains data governance framework? We have developed a data governance framework that is based on 3 elements of people, processes, and technology. And this is a dialogical process for us. It is not a top-down approach that we have developed here. It's a dialogical process where all the different stakeholders actually have dialogue, interactive, reflectively on the data processing pipelines to understand what issues to address, what principles to promote, and also how to make the data processing pipeline socially acceptable. So for us, it's a proactive process and not a reactive one. It's something because we start from the collection of the data to the deletion of the data. And what are our motivations for doing this? First of all, to comply with European Commission laws. That's the first one. The second one is also for public good, because we understand the importance of data subjects within the health data processing pipelines or workflows. And also to meet the fair data principles requirements of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And also to be transparent, because that can help to improve the social acceptability of the data processing workflows in eBrains. So for the people in eBrains, we have created and established roles and committees or task forces to address some of these data governance challenges that I've pointed out. One is a data governance working group, which is a central hub where data governance issues are discussed and addressed within eBrains and HPP. We also have data protection officers. The HPP has a data protection officer, and eBrains has a data protection officer, and HPP data protection officer will be speaking to you in a short while. And then we also have access review committee to review our access requests to make sure that data sets or pseudonymized data sets or personal data does not enter into the hands of people who do not need it or who should not have access to it. So in order not to share data arbitrarily, our access review committee assesses the request and makes sure that all issues are covered before granting access to individuals. And also we have Curation Access Request Committee that review access for curation or request for curation to ensure that the data sets that we are curating in EBRAINS and making available in EBRAINS were responsibly collected and do not have ethical or legal risk before we share them. And also we have dual use working group. And now, most importantly, we have a compliance manager, ethics compliance manager that ensures that the data providers and data users comply with available regulations, available ethical principles, and also social expectations to meet up social expectations. And then we have processes that we have established from inception of the Human Brain Project. We had the data policy manual. Now we have access policy, the EBRAINS access policy. So, and also to maintain to comply with the data protection regulations in Europe, we conduct data protection impact assessments. We have privacy policy or statement, data use agreement, data processing agreement, data provision protocol, dual use opinion, and trilateral meetings to ensure that this dialogical approach is followed to the letter. And then we have also identified technologies or technical processes to ensure responsible data governance. One is pseudonymization. All the data sets, the personal human data that we curate are pseudonymized. We do not share raw data sets in EBRAINS. We also have encryption in some of our services, especially the TVB, where data sets are encrypted at rest and on transit to ensure the security of the data. And we also have Open Minds that addresses some of the technical and human elements of metadata standardization to ensure findability and accessibility of the data sets that we have in EBRAINS, and also to ensure that human data is not shared arbitrarily. We have developed a technical interface to help us to do that, which is the Human Data Gateway. So all pseudonymized data sets are shared through this gateway to ensure that we identify the users and make sure that the users sign a data use agreement before we grant them access to the human data. So the aim of data governance in general in EBRAINS is to make data processing and data workflows ethically responsible, legally compliant, culturally sensitive, which is important for Europe, and also socially acceptable. So that is the goal of data governance in EBRAINS and the HBP. But what are the specific legal provisions that we need to consider? How do we address some of the GDPR issues and data protection issues that come up as I've identified? I will hand it over to the data protection officer of the HBP to tell us this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, my name is Simisola Akintoye, and I'm the Data Protection Officer for the Human Brain Project. So quickly, I'm going to talk through data protection mechanisms in EBRAINS. I'm going to be looking at the GDPR main provisions. I'm going to be talking about clarification of roles and responsibilities. And then finally, the EBRAINS data protection mechanisms. So the GDPR, of course, is the General Data Protection Regulation. This is the regulation that helps us to be fully compliant with data protection mechanisms across the project. We are very, very mindful of the major provisions of the GDPR and how it impacts on our role. And in fact, the core mechanisms that we've developed in HBP as well as EBRAINS. So the GDPR applies to processing of personal data. Data processing itself is just any set of operations that are performed on the data. So personal data is information relating to identified or identifiable individuals, living persons. So we recognize that the GDPR is only applicable to living individuals. Any sort of operations that is performed on data of such individuals would be classified as personal data. And then the word identifiable becomes really critical, because if anyone can identify a natural person using all means reasonably likely to be used, then that information is indeed personal data. So that brings within the ambit of the data that we process in HBP a lot of information that could be classed as personal data. Yeah. So we have general personal data. Of course, we've got names, telephone numbers, email addresses, identification numbers, different general personal data that we would run across on a daily basis. And then we've got the extra layer of personal data, the one the GDPR calls special category personal data. This is also known as sensitive personal data. So information relating to race, to origin, to political opinions, religious beliefs. For us, we're very concerned about genetic data concerning health, data concerning sexual orientation, for example, because we deal with a lot of genetic health data, MRI data, fMRI data, and this really has extra level and extra layer of protection as provided for in the GDPR. So it becomes very important for us to not only deal with this data on the normal level that the GDPR prefers, but then going the extra layer to protecting sensitive special category personal data. So very broad default duties, just taking you through what the GDPR provides. It gives a lot of data protection principles that we have to comply with. The GDPR generally bans sensitive data, special category data that we looked at before. It is generally banned to process. Of course, you've got the general exemption in Article 9, and that's making sure that there's extra layer of protection as we process that data. So generally, we wouldn't be allowed to process special category personal data on its own, except we have the extra layer of protection. So the GDPR provides a lot of rights and freedoms to data subjects. We've got subject access rights, control rights. Data subjects have the right to be forgotten. They have the right to object to their personal data, and all these have to be complied with in the GDPR. So the data protection principles, for example, data must be protected in a fairly, lawful, and transparent manner. Data must also be processed for the purpose to which is being collected. Just the minimal personal data should be collected, so your data minimization, confidentiality, data must be accurate, and of course, the storage limitation of data has to be complied with. One major thing that the GDPR also provides is the demonstration of compliance, and that is new in the GDPR. So in whatever form that we process data or we make sure data is processed securely, we then have to demonstrate compliance. And that makes it very important for us in our task, because everything we do, we have to record it, we have to make sure that it's in compliance with the GDPR, and we have to be able to show it to the authorities if this is relevant and if this is required for us. So the other things that we have in the GDPR is the controllership mechanisms and other provisions that the GDPR provides, making sure that we're either data protection controllers or we're data protection data processors, for example. So this just gives a pictorial analysis of what the Article 6 and the data protection principles provide for us in terms of lawfulness, purpose limitation, minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, and also accountability. So what is required before we process personal data? One important thing is consent. Consent is very fundamental to personal data processing. However, we should always know that consent is not the only way to comply with personal data. So not just making sure that we get consent as the only thing that we need to do. We can also, for example, derive a lawful basis for processing personal data from the performance of a contract, for example, from legal obligation, from vital interest, public interest, or indeed legitimate interest. So it is bearing in mind the plethora of lawful basis that the GDPR provides. And particularly because of what we do in the HBP, we have to be really, really wary of the fact that we may not always be able to derive consent alone, and we have to then go back to the other lawful basis that we have in the GDPR. One of the ones that we use is public interest, knowing that the GDPR, HBP as a project is focused on the advancement of neuroscience, neuromorphic computing, brain-related medicines. We're developing all these therapies, and we have to be aware that we may not always get consent. So the public interest lawful basis is very, very important because of the advancement of scientific research. So, of course, what is consent? Consent is any freely or specific given and information that indicates the wishes by which a data subject signifies its agreement. Consent has to be affirmative, it has to be informed, it has to be voluntary, it must be based on a specific information. So we try and make sure that we've got informed consent mechanisms that are very, very really, really important for us to be able to derive our lawful basis. So we go to the next layer, which is the clarification of roles and responsibilities. For us in the HBP, we have to identify whether we are either a controller or a processor. In the HBP, of course, we do have to understand the levels of protection that we have to provide. We deal with personal data sometimes, and we do have to sort of outsource the processing of this personal data. So it is about understanding whether we are either joint controllers, data controllers, or indeed processor. In the GDPR, a controller is a natural person, a public authority, who on their own or jointly with others determining the purpose and means of processing personal data. And doing this means that we have to be in the position where we make the decisions regarding the processing of this personal data. Or do we do this in conjunction with somebody else? Then that makes us a joint controller. So identifying that fine line between controllership and processor is very important for us, whether we are the ones that are responsible for determining how personal data should be processed, or whether we are data processors. In other words, we process personal data on behalf of data controllers. So we then, of course, have to have a data processing agreement if we're going to be appointing a data controller, so a data processor. So we try and understand our roles and responsibilities in that regard. So again, we look at, of course, the provisions of the EDPB guidelines around data controllers, around accountability. We look at the technical and organizational measures that we have to put in place, particularly understanding that we do in fact process special category personal data. What do we do in terms of, making sure that we have these technical and organizational measures in place? And of course, the data controller definition that we have in the EDPB guidelines, which I referred to earlier, has to do with understanding which of these do we do. Do we determine? Do we do it alone? Do we do it jointly? The purpose and means of processing personal data. Thank you. So what do we do in the HBP and EBRAINS with regards to data protection? Of course, we know that the HBP itself, we are a data controller in a lot of ways. We set policies, we grant access, we develop technical measures, and we can be called a joint controller because we do this in jointly with other services as well, other partners, just ensuring that data protection concerns, of course, are adequately addressed. So we take what we call an origin-based approach to data protection. And this means that the data provider is contractually responsible for the data that they provide to the infrastructure. So this origin-based approach helps us to understand the origin, the starting points of the data. And then we understand that, of course, our role is being derived there as a joint controller or indeed a controller or processor. So what mechanisms have we put in place? We've appointed a data protection officer. Myself as a data protection officer for HBP. We do have a data protection officer for EBRAINS as well. We then create structures that allow consideration of data protection issues. For example, the data governance working group. We have a data governance executive committee, and indeed a security working group. But most importantly, we help to develop policies and procedures. And many of these help us to identify our roles, our responsibilities, the risks risks that are involved in our processing, and how we make data sharing more responsible, which is the core of what we do. So the EBRAINS data protection impact assessments, for example, help us at the start of any processing of personal data to understand, to identify the risks involved, the measures to mitigate that risk, and of course to document and review, monitor whatever the outcome is. So at the start of any processing, when we get approached by either partners or even a new processing from that comes into light within the HBP, we start, or the EBRAINS, we start by understanding what the processing is about, speaking to different people involved to understand the life cycle of this processing. What risks does it pose? How do we then mitigate this risk in a way that it helps us to balance the interest between sharing this data, making it available for research, while still protecting the data subject's rights as entrenched in the GDPR. We then could develop, for example, as part of our mechanisms, what we call an access policy. An access policy can be used for making researchers find, share, and use this data responsibly. We've developed a access control mechanism that is based on authentication, agreement, and authorization, in which we, of course, authenticate users, we get them to agree to the processing, and then we authorize them once they've agreed. So, of course, in agreeing, they have a data use agreement where they agree to be responsible for the data as data controllers for the data that they are downloading, that they are using, that they're researching on, and they have to do this in a responsible manner. We've also developed our privacy policy that helps us to understand privacy mechanisms within the project and how it is implemented. We put this on the website for users, for researchers to be able to use, to be able to see. We have a data provision protocol for researchers that want to integrate their data into the research software that we've created, which is EBRAINS. We have a provision protocol for how they can do this responsibly without infringing on rights and freedoms of data subjects. And of course, a data management plan, and that helps us to determine the life cycle of data from collection to deletion, and how this can be responsibly embedded into the project through the data management plan. So in recap, for this part of my session, we've looked at the principles of data protection, the lawful basis for processing, of course, processing sensitive personal data, and the extra layer of processing in terms of how we derive our lawful basis. We look at the EBRAINS data protection mechanisms and policies and procedures that we have developed within the HBP and EBRAINS over time. So with this, I'm going to hand over to the compliance officer, Will, and he will take you through the compliance process. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Simi. That's very useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we handle ethics compliance in EBRAINS. We've talked a lot about data governance and data protection. And of course, in EBRAINS, we handle a huge amount of data, not just human, but animal and technical data as well, software, things like that. Often this is handled in large quantities and at huge sizes of data sets. But we have to pay attention to particular data sets which have to come under a certain amount of scrutiny, as Sumi has talked about. So, for example, pseudonymized human data are potentially very sensitive and subject to a lot of conditions when you share them. So we have to make sure that we handle them appropriately. Animal data, of course, is another sort of sensitive issue that we handle within EBRAINS. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. We're going to focus on human data. So each of these features pose their own challenges regarding ethics compliance, data governance, and data protection. When we're talking about human data, as Simi mentioned, we have to think about data subject rights, the right to be forgotten, the right to deletion. There's a number of them that we can identify within GDPR. We have to think about informed consent, whether that is or is not going to be the lawful basis for processing. That is a particular data protection issue. But on the ethical level, of course, we have to think about whether the data was collected in an ethically compliant manner, which is to say that they were given informed consent and things like that. Is the data anonymized or pseudonymized? This affects, to a certain extent, how we share it, or whether we can indeed share it on EBRAINS. But it's also an ethical issue, not just a data protection issue. It's about how you view those human data subjects in that data set, whether they are still identifiable. and animal welfare. As I said, we're not going to talk too much about that today. But dual use as well is another ethical issue, which is raised by the kind of data handled in EBRAINS. Is it the kind of data that has not just use for science, not just used for the civil applications, but could also have applications, for example, in military context? These are the kind of broad ethical issues that we're trying to tackle in a lot of the ethics compliance and ethical considerations that we make in EBRAINS. And they raise these quite broad questions of responsibility, accountability, and data ethics. So our processes, the way that we handle ethics is largely based upon European principles, which have been built out of the Human Brain Project. The Human Brain Project was built out of this Horizon 2020 funding stream, which has an ethics categories associated with it. Now, some of these will be more or less relevant to the data that we handle in EBRAINS, things like human beings, personal data, non-EU countries, dual use. These things are more relevant to the kind of data that we handle in the Human Brain Project and subsequently in EBRAINS. But it goes to show that there's a lot of ethical issues that we do consider, at least, within the processes that we handle in EBRAINS. So, specifically drilling down onto human data. There's a number of responsibilities. Damian earlier talked about PPT, people, processes, and technologies. Those people have responsibilities, and within the sort of scientific ecosystem and the small part of it that EBRAINS is part of, there are a number of people who are interacting. There is the researcher who is coming to EBRAINS with a set of data, and they have a certain number of responsibilities. And there is EBRAINS themselves, which we have our own responsibilities as a research infrastructure that is subsequently sharing that potentially sensitive human data. So for human data, we consider things like data protection, as Simi talked about, informed consent, like Simi talked about, and anonymization, pseudonymization are subjects identifiable. And subsequently, something that we don't talk about a lot, perhaps we should do, is the source of that data, whether it's EU or non-EU data. Now, strictly speaking, whether it's EU, if it's EU data, then GDPR applies. However, EBRAINS takes a sort of a broader approach to say that we should treat all data, regardless of its source, with a certain level of sensitivity, certain level of respect. So when we're reviewing whether or not we can ethically share a piece of data through EBRAINS, typically we will apply GDPR to it regardless, so that we are being fair and we're being leveled and balanced across the board with all data that comes in. There are other considerations that, of course, you should also consider with human data. Damian talked a little bit earlier about the biases in the way that we collect data. If your data collection method is biased to a certain extent, perhaps the sample isn't representative. Perhaps you're collecting only from Western or European people. Is that data then generalizable beyond that particular population? So biases can exist in data. So those are some of the ethical issues that we really have to consider. When you have collected this data and it's produced, and you bring it to EBRAINS, we will have a number of questions. We will have a number of things that we have to think about, because we know for EBRAINS that we have certain responsibilities that we have to be very aware of. So typically, we'll ask for some demonstration or evidence of ethical approval from your local institution. We may ask to see a template consent form, if that is applicable, if indeed consent is going to be a lawful basis for processing. And if it's outside the European Union, typically we'll ask for confirmation that the research could have been legally carried out in an EU country. That is us identifying that GDPR can be applied to it and it meets those GDPR requirements. Now, the way that we check these things, the way that we do it is we have an EBRAINS ethics compliance check. This is a process that ensures that all ethical and legal requirements are met, such that we can be sure that we can legally share it and ethically share it and responsibly share it on EBRAINS. It's really important to note that this isn't an ethics review. The EBRAINS ethics compliance team is not going to give you ethical approval to commence any work. And we do not seek to replace any local approvals that you would have to get as a matter of course through the research process at your local institution. All we're doing is checking that all appropriate ethical compliance procedures have been followed at your local institution. And subsequently, we can then take that data and share it on our platforms and do that legally. So it's really clear that it's not an ethics review. Now, the way that we collect this information is through an ethical issues and approvals survey. This will ask for a number of very important questions, which will let us, as the ethics compliance manager and the team around that, will let us make the judgment about whether it meets the requirements that we've set. So we'll ask for details about the data. What's the legal basis for processing? What's the anonymization status? Is it anonymized, pseudonymized, or is it indeed a raw data without any anonymization? And we will ask for evidence of ethical approval. So this will typically be a start and end date of your ethical approval, because typically it will be ethical approval for a certain period. And any ethical approval ID, so that if we need to, we can go to the institution and check that that's in place. Now, requirements can differ from data type to data type, and we might come back to you as a data provider to ask for further information and clarification if there is some confusion. But typically, this can be quite a lean process and handled very quickly. Now, not only are we talking about here data providers, so people who have a data set and they come to eBRAINS with that data set to then share it, but there's a whole new set of data users. Now, obviously, those two circles may overlap. There'll be a significant number of users who are also providers, but each one has their own responsibility. So if you are coming to eBRAINS and looking for a data set, you have a certain number of responsibilities as well. You need to know where that data comes from. You need to understand how and where you can use that data. You need to understand the limitations of that data and if any biases exist in it. And you need to understand the license through which that data is shared. Now, typically, this kind of information will be found on the data card associated with the data set in the knowledge graph. That will show you where the data's come from. It will typically show you how and where you can use that data. If it's pseudonymized human data, then you will have to agree to a data use agreement, which will make that very explicit. And the license on there will be very clear as well. If you are a data provider, so you're the other end of that spectrum, you have a data set and you're coming to eBRAINS with it to share. When you come to us, make sure that you have the ethical approval in place, because we'll obviously ask for that. If you're talking about human data, then we'll have to have some evidence of that you have a legal basis for processing. If that's consent, that needs to be very clear. And you need to understand the implications of sharing the data through eBRAINS. You need to understand that it will be shared globally. It will be shared with researchers who may go and do different things with it, change it. You should be attributed when that happens and referenced. However, you have to understand that it's going to be shared and it's going to be made accessible and findable, and that can be something that you need to understand. So those are the very broad, a brief overview of the ethical compliance issues and associated with the sharing of eBRAINS data and the accessing of eBRAINS data. Damian has talked about the data governance issues that we have and the data governance processes and people and technologies that we put in place to handle those issues. And Simi, our data protection officer, has talked about the data protection issues that we have, specifically concerning a special category personal data. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact either myself, Simi, or Damian, and we'll be really happy to answer them. Or else go and explore the eBRAINS website, www.ebrains.eu. In there, you'll find access to all these different types of data, as well as a huge amount of supporting information, which should be able to hopefully answer any questions you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you.